Okay, we've got a question up here. So let's get going. Everybody, I hope can hear me. We're going to start with a little bit of a kind of a recapture of where Santa Clara County is and where the nation is and the world is in COVID. A little bit later, I'll talk about some therapies, a little bit about who's susceptible and who's not, but just want to kind of refresh a couple of things with you. And we've talked about these things before, but I want to show them to you again. Let me get this out of the way. Going over that side. If you look at this, this is the county data. So I just want to get people up to speed on that. I've heard different things said about having a resurgence and all this sort of thing. We're not actually having that at all. Total deaths are 154 as of right now. It's been plus or minus one, well, not minus, but around that for several weeks. So it's quite flat. What has changed, and you can see that in how many tests are getting done. So we're at 4,000 here. And if you look at the number of tests, you know, you can have to smooth it out, but there's a trend to more and more testing. The little reds down here tell you how many are positive. And so, for example, out of 4,000, there were, 12 that were positive. So it's really not much of a jump. So locally, it's still remarkably well controlled. And I bring that up with some emphasis because I've heard some things that are making it sound more scary than in fact it is. If you look at the number of ICU beds in the county that are occupied with COVID related, it's 25. It's a trivial amount of the available ICU beds. I shouldn't say trivial, it's a small number. So we're not in any local danger of some big tsunami of new disease. So there's just no evidence of that. So this is the, if you ever want to go, it's the SCC Gov, Santa Clara County government.org, and you can see this dashboard, and that's how many tests are being done and how many are positive and how many deaths there are and how many people are in ICU and what the available number of beds and stuff. It's quite reassuring that our local behavior is sure taking the sting out of this disease. No one can hear me? Can anyone hear?
Molly can't answer you. You got a space.
Yeah, you sound fine. You're louder now.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to put you back on mute for a bit. Okay. So anyway, county's not much of a problem. I'm having a little bit of a throat. That may be why I'm not very loud. The other thing to look at is, and this is one that people keep referring to, and this is the international, the WSU numbers. And as you can see, their prediction by October is down about 15% as it was before. It was about 210. And they're actually predicting fewer deaths by October than they expected. It's still going to turn out to be in the 200 to 300,000 death or as an annual number. So yeah, it's down if you look at that in terms of their health metrics. Looking at the one most people are familiar with, which is Johns Hopkins number, which are a little misleading, but can still get you some numbers in terms of number of deaths. Put that in this perspective, when this is where this comes in to be a useful thing. If you go and look at, well, United States and then versus compare it to almost anywhere else. Here's, for example, the deaths per 100,000 in Belgium, which is 84, and here it's 36 per 100,000. And here, for example, is Italy or United Kingdom, which is 63. We're actually doing pretty well in terms of deaths per 100,000. And at this point, we're not behind in some meaningful way in terms of the emergence of the disease in our population. Now, some of the areas in the United States are behind the time curve. In other words, they're going to start to unfold in some of the other states that, in a way that we haven't seen, or we've already seen in California, for example, in New York, mostly Southern California. So our deaths per 100,000 are still pretty modest. Now, there's certainly a bunch, as you can see down here, a cohort of people who are, much lower. But still, we're doing pretty well for a diverse nation on a broad physical scale. And then looking at the numbers per 100,000. So for example, if you look at California, just to put that in the context, California's down here at, you know, well, I don't want to say a trivial number. It's not trivial. It's something serious. But at 14 per 100,000, as opposed to the United States, which is 37 per 100,000, still very reassuring. So we're doing really well locally. And as you know, there's been a statewide demand that we wear masks in public places, and I think that's a great idea. But I think any fear, there's no real place for it. As long as you're good about a mask in public places. The background is still always going to be fomites. In other words, these places you touch. It's probably not the big driver when you see big spikes, but it's going to be, there's a background issue. So you always want to be conscientious about what you touch and when you wash your hands and how often you clean surfaces that you're in contact with or other people are in contact with. So that should be an ongoing consideration. But in terms of perception of risk, at least around here, it's quite low. And I think I'd continue to think of it that way. We're not seeing any trends or changes that would suggest that's changed. Now, maybe I've gotten misinformation, but I was told by some that the perception had changed in people's mind, and there's just no data to support that. So I'm very reassured about that. This is an interesting graph looking at the mutational change over time. And part of that, these colored, we'll make it in a simple pattern. That the colors will tell you that we have a different distribution of these subtypes than, say, they have in the upper Midwest or in the East. So we've got a little bit of a mix in terms of the genomics and genetics of our strains around here. But there again, the incidence is quite low. The other thing to keep in mind, I think it'll come up in what I'm going to present to you a little bit later, is there's actually some evidence, and you don't want to presume on this, but there's some pretty powerful suggestive evidence that, as does happen with many potentially lethal diseases, it's becoming less lethal. In other words, that mutational change that this tracks actually results in the strains becoming weakened and less likely to cause disease. So that's a good, so we've seen a lot of good, again, locally, seeing some really promising things in terms of our risk by our behavior as we get out and around, and yet when we're careful in public places, the risk is to be low as long as you're careful about hand washing and sterilizing surfaces and that sort of thing. I don't think we've got as much of an issue around here of the super spreaders, which a lot of places have. So it's fomites and masks. We should pretty much cover the problem. I'll come back to these anytime anybody wants to, but they're kind of give you a good broad scale picture of what's happening. Kind of hold on to those. Okay, Phil's going to keep track of some questions that you might have. I want to just show you the presentation I wanted to bring to your attention. And yes, I will get to the meaning of life. We really actually will address that. This is mostly just a recapitulation of what I've just shown you in terms of graphs, where the deaths are and the cases are and that sort of thing. I want to talk a little bit about what the treatments are that are emerging. They're almost funny, and I will explain what I mean by that. I saw, a week or so ago, it was like front page news. Oxford, mentions that there's this new miraculous thing that's going to change the course of the disease. And all it was steroids, dexamethesone. And the reason why I say that's all that was is it's a little bit funny. In the early course of this disease worldwide, any doc who had seen a patient with this kind of broad scale inflammatory disease would have used steroids. That's just what you would have done. And for some reason, there was an initial pushback, and actually people were disabused of the notion of using steroids. They very quickly got back to the use of steroids. And so it's pretty common now that you'd be using steroids. Dexamethasone, prednisone, these are glucocorticoids. And I'm going to tell you something about that. Colchicine is another one that started to be effective. And dexamethasone and colchicine both have something in common. They turn off your body. In other words, what is happening in a lot of the disease sequela from COVID is your body's reaction to the infection rather than the infection itself. So dexamethasone turns off your immune system. Colchicine basically shuts down your metabolism at some level. I'm simplifying, but those are pretty close for the discussion I hope we can have. So those have been both have shown some effects anywhere from not early, but from anywhere the early emerging active phase of the disease. They've been helpful at that phase, and it makes a difference. It's meaningful, especially in the later, more serious cases. They've been looked at both in moderate to severe as well as early severe. So that's kind of nice. That's a treatment. So there's some reassurance there that we have some treatment options. This particular favipiravir is a antiviral. As it mentions, it inhibits the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. In other words, it just makes the genetic expression of the virus, it impairs that, so it can't reproduce very well. It's approved in Japan for atypical flu, not for just typical seasonal flu where we would use Tamiflu, because they are trying to use it for a more severe form. It has got some evidence of being helpful in Ebola and a number of other viruses. One of my patients actually told me that they had seen that this had been approved in Russia for use in COVID. And that makes sense. It's not a bad idea. But the studies that have been done haven't been real slam dunk studies. But you know, heck, if you had it in your armamentarium, it'd be worth using. Is kind of what it looks like. As I mentioned, the evidence of the virus strain is weakening. So given that we have some therapies, we have some treatments, not cures, but some treatments, which will certainly improve your chances of coming out of the ICU and off respirators if you're on those. That's kind of reassuring. And from my mind, that's really what I'm looking for, is are we making progress in treating the disease? Because that gets to the issues about immunization. As I've mentioned before, I'm a little skeptical that we're going to have very effective immunizations just because of how fungible this virus is. It changes a lot. And as it's in a family of viruses our bodies have a lot of experience with and yet continue to be susceptible to, I think this may fall into that category. There may be a series of immunizations that will cover many of the strains, but it seems unlikely that we've got anything that will cover everything. So it's just to let you know, it's more reassuring in some sense. Well, it'd be great if we had a cure, but it's more reassuring in some sense to know that we do have some therapies. These are examples of that. So we'll get to some more COVID stuff, but what my promise was is to talk about exercise. As you know, exercise is the single most effective thing you can do to prevent the disease. Given that the primary mechanism of COVID causing debility and death is the imbalanced response of your immune system to the infection, what will tend to balance that system is exercise. A sedentary lifestyle downregulates the biological energy, the cellular energy necessary to make the body able to cope with infection. And so exercise is really the key. A lot of this stuff you've heard before, but I want to make it very specific about so that when you're more and more of you are kind of designing your own exercise or working with somebody, I want you to know what your goals are, but this tells you a little bit about what you can correct. The insulin resistance, coronary disease, all of these things can be improved by proper exercise. Notice wrong exercise program won't improve those things. In fact, will make it worse. That's an allusion to, again, this notion of overtraining. Overtraining is a real thing. And I would say 20% of my patients are prone to that. Not 5% or 1%, as much as 20% are actually overtraining. Overtraining is always getting ahead of the recovery cycle of your body. And part of overtraining is emphasizing a single kind of training. The classic kind of almost cartoon version of that is somebody you know, at the gym who's on the treadmill for hour after hour after hour. That's all they do. That's an example of not being productive, in fact, being counterproductive. One of the things that you're improving is this VO2 max. That means your body's ability to create a oxidative environment. Breathing is oxidative, and your body to clear it as an oxidative, sort of the exhaust phase. And so this is one of the most important things you can do to improve your cellular ability to overcome illness. So these are some of the goals that you have. And this is a philism, and that is one size doesn't fit all, and he's absolutely right about that. One of the things you want to do, you want to encourage your friends to do, is they don't know what their fitness level is, they don't know what their health level is, because they know what they weigh or they know what they look like in a nice dress. It's a more complex thing than that, and you should get as much information about where you are and where your location is in order to map where you want to go. Just keep that in mind. Some of you from Tempest will remember us talking about the ANACAP map. This is a very important way to think about what kind of person am I? And we can get into it at a genetic level, but basically the thing to understand or see is there's 4 quadrants to this map, and seen to the right, it builds good tissue. That's anabolic. That's where the ANACAP comes from. Seen to the left is breaks down stuff. That's catabolic. The body is in constant dynamic tension between tearing down old stuff and building new stuff. You want to be as much as you can in your exercise, your sleep, your spiritual life, your relationships, making new stuff, making good stuff. And that's the anabolic side of it. The vertical thing is looking at insulin resistance. There are other metrics, but insulin resistance is a very good metric about what your underlying metabolism is. Is it prone to inflammation? Is it prone to fat storage? Is it prone to high levels of insulin, which itself is inflammatory? Then you're insulin resistant. If you're insulin sensitive, then your body handles or responds to insulin correctly. These 4 quadrants literally have a picture. This person in the upper right, quadrant one, that is an athlete. That is a deeply fit, and I mean almost from the genetic ground level up, a deeply fit person. They have high anabolic hormones, they have high insulin sensitivity, they have a lot of cellular energy. They're kind of the lucky one on the map. Number 2, no fun to admit, I'm kind of in 2. I'm basically an anabolic animal. I'll get strong and big if I exercise, but I'll also get fat if I eat wrong. So that's that category. 3 is the person, as it says here, is going to have diabetes, they're going to have disease and stroke, osteoporosis, and they're obese. You can almost pick these people out on the street, the sedentary versions of these. You just know who they are. Quadrant 4 is a substantial percentage of the practice anyway. And these are people who couldn't get fat if they wanted to and can't, and it's hard work, if even possible, to gain muscle. They're, as it says here, they're frail, they have dry skin, they have dry mucosa, they tend to depression, and there's some chemistry behind that. They tend to osteoporosis, but they tend also not to get cancer, and because why? They're insulin sensitive, and they don't have very high growth hormone levels, which is another thing that can stimulate cancer. So they've got each one of these quadrants, well, one's all positive, but each of these quadrants have some advantages and disadvantages. You want to begin to think about where you fit on this map, because it's going to help you make some decisions about the right kind of diet and the right kind of exercise that you should choose. So these are the systems that we need to fix. Mitochondria, kill or be killed. There are thousands per cell, as an average, 1,000 per cell. They are the virtual engine of life. When they're healthy, you're healthy. When they're not, you're not. And there are many genetic linked diseases, but there are also some induced diseases that are related to mitochondrial function. The mitochondria is where the respiratory chain takes oxygen, combines it with carbon, and you breathe out carbon dioxide. It's huge. Neurological and neuromuscular well-being. A lot of people think they overlook the fact that the brain and balance and coordination has to be trained just like muscle tone does. It gets worse over time. It gets detrained over time. Many of the things we associate with the function of the brain are trainable, and many of those things, those functions are lost if they're not attended to. So you need to work on foot speed, coordination, balance, hand-eye coordination. You want to keep challenging that system because you're training that system just like you're training your coordination and your strength in other ways. Joints and skeletal health, a lot of training, and we've seen this a lot. People lose track of the fact that when you're moving a weight or jumping up and down or running from here to there, you really need to be taking care of your joints as you do it, because joints, they need your body to be moved through a full range of motion. That does a number of things. It brings nutrition back into the joint spaces, and it stimulates the ability of those joints to heal. So don't just lift something, push something, pull things. Think in terms of how do I use full range of motion? When I do curls, do I come all the way out? Do I stand all the way out? When I jump on a box, do I just jump, or I throw my arms and grab my body and pull my legs up? In other words, you want to be as athletic and full range as possible. Muscle mass is not the same thing as mitochondrial health, but one of the things that is associated with health and longevity over time is muscle mass. We see in this practice, Phil actually sees it before I do because he does the body counts. We have a fair number of people who are frankly sarcopenic. That's the medical name for don't have enough muscle. And people who are, and by the way, that's quadrant 4, the sarcopenic patients are going to have difficulty as they age. They're going to become frail and more prone to falling and more prone to fractures when they fall, and will not, if they fall, have the strength to catch themselves if that were an opportunity. So muscle mass is another one of the goals that you should have. These are the tools. They are the kinds of exercise that will achieve the 4 changes that we just talked about. A lot of you know this, but I want to remind you of them. So these, by the way, this presentation, as far as a visual thing, we have, it'll be available for you to look at. And if you have questions on that, feel free to ask them. But when you think about your exercise, what am I doing this? Involving lots of joints and compound and closed chain and multiplanar. In other words, it's not just front plane, it's rotational plane, lateral plane. Keep all the systems moving in this global athletic way. Intense interval training. A lot of people are familiar with what's called Tabatas. Tabatas are the 20 seconds intense, 10 seconds of rest. Tabata did a fair amount of pretty interesting work looking at what is the intensity and rest cycles that are most effective. And 20-10 is the most. There are some kinds of interval sequencing that some people just can't quite bring enough intensity to the 20-10s, and they'll do a 30-30 or they'll do a 30-60. That's all possible. That may be necessary, but what you're shooting for is 20-10s, whether it's jump rope or rowing or cycling or anything. That kind of intensity does a lot of things in terms of mitochondria, and that's why you're looking at. But as you're doing that, you don't want to lose sight of the fact that you do want to have what we call sustained sub-maximal. In other words, it's not clear in that intensity range as the Tabatas, but it's darn near. It's right at the threshold of the possible for at least 8 to 10 minutes. The proprioceptive work, neuromuscular work, it's agility ladders, it's hand-eye coordination, it's juggling. You notice I've got juggling balls on my desk, and there are things that they're not big things. They're not something where you need to go to the gym to do. They're things that will keep you challenged neuromuscularly, neurologically. Core training comes out of almost every kind of training properly done. But the big lifts are great for this. If you never did anything else, if you could just do a great deadlift, you've done almost everything you need. And between a deadlift and a proper pull-up, you don't need a gym. You can just do those things and do them well. It's not quite that simple, but close. Now, here's the news I think I want you guys to hear. If I were you, thinking of COVID, thinking of other things, I would not be going to clubs. I would not be going to courtside and so on and so forth. They're just too large, too many people in and out, too many passing through to be able to control them as a risk environment. I think you want to either 1, build out a gym at home, and we're going to give you some guidance on that, or 2, be in sort of a boutique setting, a small gym. Some of you know Kim's, I can name a bunch of others around here. that's an environment where if you know the people there, you know they're taking care of things, you know they're keeping them clean. It's not the too many loose pieces that have no centralized control the way a lot of the big clubs do. I think, at least for the near future, for people who have any concern about their general risk, I would get out of the club environment. I just don't think I don't think it's safe. I don't think it's likely to be safe for some time. So Phil, who's run some big clubs, he's even grumpier about some of the stuff than I am, but he's right about all the points he's put in here. Everything from staff to COVID is what you get in a club setting. So just, I would think about that, or build your own gym. We're going to talk about that a little bit too. This is key. It's not who you watch, but who's watching you. A proper, effective exercise is the best thing for back pain and shoulder pain and so on and so forth. But those very things that can have the most benefit are also dangerous. An improper squat is how you're going to hurt your back. A proper squat is how you're going to strengthen your back. And you're not going to be able to tell. It's just human nature. You cannot tell. You need somebody to see you. You can watch somebody do a perfect squat, and you will not do a perfect squat. You need somebody to watch you. So far it's possible, I encourage everyone to get a trainer. Now, whether they come and train you at home or they do Zoom training, it's just worth it, because that's how you're going to, one, be following a coherent plan. And it's not about intelligence. It's just the mirror of function. There's a reason every great athlete has at least one coach. He may, Usain Bolt knows how to sprint, but a trainer helped him know how to get out of the blocks, how to get through the acceleration phase. He made him a faster runner, but he also made him less prone to injury. And the injuries are the other risk of all exercise. So you want somebody watching you if it's at all possible. I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm advocating everybody needs a trainer, but that's what I'm doing. Again, it's not who you watch, it's who's watching you. Please put that into your thoughts or your plans. Now, I'm recommending at least that you build a home gym. How am I doing on time? Okay. I'm trying to keep it short for questions. Exercise equipment. We've got some ways for you to build a gym. Under a K, a jump rope. We started kind of switching, or I shouldn't say started kind of. We're, as many of you know, I'm a big fan of, for good reason, of heart rate based training. And the primary one that we've had forever is no longer supported. No one else has come along with anything better. What we found is this Pulver H10 heart rate monitor is a strap, and the software for that will upload into a coached environment so I can see your workouts, or actually Phil can see your workouts. So I mean, it's amazing. What kind of a business model where they don't sell you a $700 watch, they sell you a $100 thing. But anyway, it works pretty well. We've got a number of patients who are using it, including Phil. That's why he's so skinny and handsome. So that way we can look at your heart rate profiles and tell you if you're pushing too early, or you're not pushing enough, or you're not enough variety. We can tell a lot from heart rate. But again, a jump rope, and this is fun to me. A number of patients, not one, but two, but a number of my patients made some significant incremental improvement in their HDL2B, their exercise-induced improvement, the HDL that is reversing heart disease. And I said, well, how'd you do that? I said, well, I don't know. I said, well, what are you doing? Jumping rope. So jumping rope is a good exercise, always has been, widely known to be, but don't underestimate how powerful that can be. So we've kind of got different levels, how much space you have and how much you want to spend and how much you're going to dedicate to using it. Phil has a power rack on here under 1,000. And he's done the research, so I believe him. Last time I bought a power rack for the gym across the street, $1,000 was the cheapest power rack I could find. And your power rack, the nice thing about it is you can safely do squats and pull-ups and deadlifts and so on and so forth in an environment where the weight is protected. It won't roll on your feet or drop somewhere that you don't want it to drop. But if there are good, you should consider a power rack. And then these are things to add. As a single piece of equipment, Concept 2 rower is just phenomenal. It's working every joint in the body, every muscle in the body. It can work in, the nice thing is there's very little transitional energy, so you can speed up and slow down very quickly and get some of those Tabatas in. It's a very effective way. So again, we've got some information here if you want to look at building out a gym. But again, who's watching you? Make sure you know somebody's watching you. I don't want you getting injured from a deadlift or a squat or a front squat or any of those, which can happen if it's not done carefully or done properly. There. Oh, I gave away the secret. The secret to life, we thought about that. It's be kind. Now, I really mean that. Kindness is the milk of life, although one time called the milk of human kindness. Anyway, be kind. Phil likes this quote from you Doctor Who fans. Never be cruel, never be cowardly. Remember, hate is always foolish and love is always wise. Always try to be nice and never fail to be kind. Laugh hard, run fast. That's our message. Be kind. Okay, so that's pretty quick, but I'm open to questions and I want to answer those. What do you got, Phil? And I'll open it up for some dialogue in a minute if you want me to do that.
Face shields?
Oh.
Not?
Yeah. So one of the questions apparently several asked, or somebody asked about face shields. The advantage of the face shield is that it does take away the eye exposure. You know, any mucosal surface is a potential setting and where you might get some. The problem with a face shield, if you just, and I've seen this, where people only have a face shield, and it leaves such a large area of air circulation, I don't think it's going to get you protection through nasal and oral inhalation. So if I were going to use a face shield, I'd use a face mask. And why not? We just wear a pair of, since I wear glasses anyway, it gets pretty much the same thing. And so the face, that doesn't remove the need for a face shield in a public setting.
Vitamin D.
Oh, vitamin D. I mentioned that last time. The vitamin D efficacy is it's astounding. What a difference it makes. As most of you know, I'm not a great fan of supplements, although I do recommend some. Vitamin D is one. For those who have in the lower ranges of vitamin D, they have as much as a 10-fold increased risk of COVID as those who have a higher level. Now that doesn't mean super high is better than high. You need a good modest mid-range range. And the only way you're going to know is if you measure it. What I've been surprised over the years I've checked vitamin D is how even my tennis players who are out and fairly well tanned, at least a farmer's tan, still have low vitamin D levels. So this is one where you do want to be on some vitamin D3, and yes, it does make a difference.
You wanted to talk about the patients.
Oh, back to the therapies. You'll notice I mentioned dexamethesone and colchicine. And I said that the reason why those things worked is they turned off your immune system. And this has a not funny, only a doctor would say so, an interesting consequence. Patients on chemotherapy, we always worry about them being more vulnerable. And in many ways, they are extremely vulnerable. They do not have an increased risk of death or debility from COVID over those who are not on chemotherapy. Look, this is too big a speculation to state, but here it is anyway. I think it's because the drugs have turned off their immune system and their immune system isn't killing them, which is basically what COVID does, is create, people have heard the storm, the cytokine storm. And so having their immune system turned off is to some extent protective, but they are not at increased risk for those who don't have cancer and are not on chemotherapy. Don't abuse that. You're not immortal just because you're on chemotherapy, but it's very reassuring for me and my patients who have cancer on chemotherapy that they are not at increased risk.
Natural immunity.
Questions, several actually versions of questions about natural immunity. We have a fair amount of data on that. And what we know, and one nice study, a patient sent me was looking at for now I'm going to just use the word the vibrancy, the health of the mucosal system in younger people being part of the protection against COVID. One of the reasons they're less susceptible to the disease. But what all of those things are pointing to is that there is a natural immunity that many people have. And I don't mean they happen to have been exposed to it and have antibodies to it, which make them immune to it. They simply don't get sick when they're exposed to it. And this may have a lot to do with mucosal antibody generation. In other words, their mucosal system is able to just reject that foreign body before it actually gets to the point of generating an immune response. So yes, there is natural immunity. We know that it probably has a lot to do with health, fitness. Fitness is a big factor of that immunity. That's why 100 fit people, half or less of those people are going to get COVID if they have the same exposure in teams as those who are not fit. So that's a big issue. That's a form of natural immunity. It does exist. It's real. We've talked about incremental induced immunity. That also seems to be real, that people, getting a little bit here, a little bit there does have some cumulative effect in terms of their immunity, which answers another bunch of my questions I've seen, which is what's going to happen if I have had it? Well, am I susceptible to exactly the same thing again? The answer is no, you're not, but you're not immune to other variants. And there may be some cross immunity, which would decrease the severity if you were to contract a related variant. So there is some conferred additional immunity once you've had it. I've had a few people, several people actually, who went from IgA, IgG, IgM, IgG, and it seems like they've lost even their IgG immunity. And that happened relatively quickly. I think that may have to do with the test, because we know enough about, good, there's some more antibody tests. We know enough about the general duration of antibodies. Keep this in mind. Once the body's manufactured this little thing, this little protein, this antibody, they don't just disappear. The body has to break them down and do something else with them. The body's not very wasteful. It will use the building blocks that created those. And so that's the half-life of antibodies. Antibodies don't just disappear, but they do go over time. That's why you have to get, for example, long ago, we thought, gee, once you've had your polio shots, you never need them again. And now we know you need them in young adulthood and older adulthood, because those permanent antibodies are not permanent. They're transient to some extent. So there is some window of protection, and how long that window is and how broadly it extends to other related viruses, that part's not clear, but there is some coverage over time. It's unlikely you're going to get the same, be careful, the same strain within the same season more than once. Question of antibody testing, man, I tell you what, I'm all for it. I think it makes a difference. I've found with a number of patients that they didn't think they were sick, but they actually have all 4 of the antigenic spots and their IgG. I think that's worth knowing. I can imagine, not on a day-to-day basis, but I can imagine circumstances where knowing that could make a difference in terms of being able to see a loved one who's sick or something like that. I think that's worth knowing. What else?
Let's see.
Well, I already answered that. The death, yeah. Has anyone been without co-infections or concurrent compromise? Are there people who just, what the heck, why are they dead? The answer is yes, there are people in that category. They didn't have diabetes, they weren't obese, they weren't old, they just got COVID and died. There are cases of that. What's probably going on there is the kind of the cop-out answer every doc's going to start answering or providing going forward is, well, they had a problem we just didn't know about. I alluded to this last time a little bit when I mentioned certain people with certain known and measurable abnormalities are more prone to clotting, more prone to inflammation. Those are the people who don't actively have some other illness, but might have a greater susceptibility to the disease. That does happen. I think in terms of how do you calculate your own personal risk, if that's a low enough number, I wouldn't really put that in I wouldn't put that on your worry list, but it is a real thing. So I don't want you to get the impression that only someone who couldn't be you, who's really sick, gets it. It can happen to others as well.
Cytokine storm.
Well, the cytokine storm, that's the phrase. Well, that's why the dexamethesone works and the colchicine works, is they quell a bit of the cytokine storm. again, keeping in mind this, what people call cytokine storm, there's a difference between a little dust devil outside and a full-blown hurricane. We have cytokine storming with almost every significant illness, and they don't all kill us. COVID's a little more prone to kind of an overwhelming cytokine storm. Yes. Can we travel? Well,
It's probably air, I would think.
what's that? Oh, yeah, oh, air, yes.
Well, I'm assuming it's air.
Assuming the question was air travel. I would not travel domestically unless it's important, and I mean that. I mean, I'm not afraid. I would go visit my daughter in Wisconsin if she had some complications with one of her pregnancies. I'd get on the plane, go. But I wouldn't go just to go visit her. I'd have to have a little bit more inducement than that. And that's kind of the calibration of risk. I think it's significant still in domestic flight, but it's not as high as it was. And I think there's some calculation where it might be important. Most business travel that I know about, and I know a lot of my patients who travel for business reasons, I think a lot of that travel would be unnecessary and should be avoided in the current setting. I think international travel, we should, as soon as we've seen what summer looks like and fall looks like, we're going to have an answer. I mean, several of my family members wanted to go to Italy, and I had them planned for December, and I think that'd be I think that's as early, and that might even be too early. So international travel, I would say late fall, early winter at the earliest, and domestic travel, we'll probably have a better picture on that when some of these states that were a little behind on the time line, once they, Kansas and some of these other places, once they start unfolding, we'll have a better answer on domestic. I think they'll know that within 4 to 6 weeks. So I would begin to look at domestic travel for just non-pressing reasons in 4 to 6 weeks. And I would look at international travel more on the 6-month range. And I think that's probably going to be, that's good advice. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, the question about second wave, we're going to have more, and that has to do with social behavior. What I mean by that, it's not, oh, gee, something happens when the days get shorter and colder. It's that we change when the days get shorter and colder. And the way in which we change is the way, our furry friends and the squirrels and everybody else, they start aggregating and collecting and being together and preparing for winter. I think that social behavior will be the key to whether or not we have another upsurge and fall. So our typical, and by our typical, I mean as a human, as a species, through time, we have these seasonal changes in our behavior. And if we will factor in, we have to be conscientious about fomites, we have to be conscientious about masks in public places. We won't see a big surge. But again, humans are such that for example, I was, doesn't matter where it was, but I was at a place over the weekend, and people were pretty much acting like this didn't happen. It didn't matter. I mean, there were people, cohorts chattering and walking down the streets and going in and out of narrow alleys. It was Carmel's where it was. And acting more than I would imagine they should, as if this thing were over. If you avoid that, I think we won't have a huge upsurge and fall. But again, it's going to keep clipping away, and there's another 100,000 to go or more before the year's over. Does that answer that? Massage, acupuncture, I think those are great questions because I look at those as therapy. I think massage is one of the healthiest things you can get. Acupuncture can be for very specific indications. That's down to who the provider is and what the environment is. I would not want to go to a health spa where they've got 10 massage suites and 5. I just wouldn't do that. Back for the same reason, I wouldn't want to go to a club. But if you know a good massage therapist and their behavior, some massage therapists are very meticulous. I just know some who are that way, and they would be meticulous, and I would trust that about sterilizing the table, changing the paper. On the other hand, I spoke, trying to remember who it was, spoke with a woman who was who got a massage, and they weren't even careful about the paper where the face was, and when they turned over, the paper got off of the desk, off the table. I mean, that's an environment where I wouldn't want to be. So that comes down to the same way you choose your doctor. Do I like the guy? Do I trust the guy? Does he have the kind of skills and attention to detail that I respect? I would pay attention to those things, but in the setting where you can have some trust or faith in that, I think those are okay. They're therapeutic, they're helpful, they're going to reduce your stress, they're going to improve your immunity and your immune function. But again, I'd be really careful about it. Okay, exercise. What to emphasize for COVID? Yeah, this is the either or thing that's so common, and I want to help people with that. You know, gee, should I do? And it's not quite that simple. To the guy who asked the question, I understand the subtlety you're asking, but it's heart rate based training versus lifting things. That's not the right way to think about this. What you're trying to do is recruit your athleticism, its strength, its power, its endurance, its full range. The deep chemistry, endocrinology is related to how much of a thriving animal you are. Let me put it that way. That's not to take away of any of, the value of your soul. It's just to say we are these incredibly complex, beautiful animals. And so you want to think in terms of strength and range of motion and power and, can you do a pull-up and can you do a squat and can you do a deadlift? That should be in your mix. It's not just how long can I stand on a treadmill or how long can I get on an assault bike. I'd rather see, if you want to think in those terms, I'd rather see a circuit that involves some burst training on the assault bike and going to from a deadlift station to a pull-up station to a box jump station back to the assault bike. I mean, I want to see it all. So it's not one versus the other, it's the entire thing. What else?
This was reminding me, so watch out for myths, for example. Don't wear a mask because you're only breathing your own life.
Oh my God, nobody actually believes that, dude.
That was a contract.
I know. Okay, so I guess there are some myths that we need to address. This actually happened to a patient we know that was told by, an unnamed malefactor who happened to be a chiropractor, who said, don't ever wear a mask because you're rebreathing your own germs. Well, if you're only rebreathing your own germs, you're not going to get sick. So don't, that's almost such a silly myth, but it's an example of, I guess, how much misinformation is out there. That said, an N95 worn all the time is not a healthy thing either. So it isn't true that rebreathing your own bacteria is as bad as breathing someone else's bad bacteria. But it's certainly reasonable that if you're outside in a relatively open environment, you don't need a mask. You probably shouldn't have a mask. You need a nice free exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so that's. I hope that addresses this question. We've got a long one here. I'm trying to figure out.
Do this one first.
Okay, do masks prevent the spread of those who are infected? That's the problem. Someone who has a mask on is much less likely to communicate that disease. But keep in mind, all of the secretions of the body, the sweat, the oils of the hand, all of those things have the virus in them as well. So it really has to do with touch as much as air. And so you don't want to get any bodily fluids. Was that a Woody Allen movie or I don't know, anyway. You don't want to exchange any bodily fluids. But yes, the mask does provide partial protection. Now, there is a pretty meticulous levels of filtration with the various masks, but be clear, any mask is better than no mask, and some of the more constraining masks for some people with lung disease, they're going to do more harm to their health than if they didn't have as seriously filtering a mask, because they get into problems in terms of gas exchange. some forms of lung disease have a lot of CO2 buildup. Well, you don't need that type of mask. So one of the reasons, related, I'm going to get to it. One of the reasons you don't want to be in a club is everybody's huffing and puffing and jumping and short of breath, and they're all expectorating over everything, and that's just can't be cleaned, short of going in there and fumigating after every single person leaves. Whereas in a smaller setting, with the windows open, the doors open, the air exchange, you can keep track of what machine you touched or what weight you lifted and that sort of thing, and keep it clean. So again, back to the point. Some is better than none, more is better than some, but there's a point where it's self-defeating. And self-defeating is an example where you only go outside and you have a mask on and you don't even get in the car without a mask. That's where you're actually getting probably more cumulative health harm than benefit because of this gas exchange issue. Not about you breathing your own bacteria. So there are some limits to that.
Leads to a similar lasting permanent effects.
Okay, so lasting effects.
Positive permanent effects on asymptomatic.
Yeah. Not everybody who gets deathly ill, I'm going to leave that a little bit vague, have sequelae. They'll come up, they recover completely, they're fine, that's the end of it. They don't have any loss of lung function or kidney function or inflammation or heart disease. There are other people who will get into that kind of an ill to that point, and they will have, most common area is lungs, but we also see vascular injury. We also see some arthritis, some other inflammatory diseases that you'll be stuck with after the disease. But not everybody that gets sick has those downstream consequences, and not everybody who gets even to the point of they're in the ICU is necessarily going to have long-term health consequences. But there are those, and they're real. The majority of the time it's lungs, but it can also be other inflammatory markers like the lining of the arteries becomes sticky and inflamed, and therefore more prone to clotting and more prone to causing, buildup of plaque. Forgive me if I keep staring off to the corner. I'm trying to see things over there. So I am here and I am talking to you. Anyway, what else you got? Oh, I got an important correction. The body fluids was from Dr. Strangelove, and that's right. Now I remember. But it did sound like Woody Allen. Anyway. So the non-symptomatic people are suffering permanent damage. Boldly stated that way, that's not true. It is the case that you can have a relatively mild disease that leaves long-term consequences. That is true. So I want to kind of separate that out. It just simply isn't the case of truly asymptomatic people. And as you probably know, most people who get this are completely asymptomatic. They don't have any disease, they don't have any fever, they don't have anything except they had a blip when they had the positive exposure to the virus. But yeah, there is a risk of a relatively mild disease having long-term consequences.
You answered second wave, right? So
yeah,
this is the only other one that we haven't got to yet, which we kind of touched on.
Yeah. So the question is, how long do we have to live this way? I think at least another year. I think when we first talked, I told you, I probably thought this was about a 2-year cycle while we're making adjustments in the population and in terms of our own immunity and social behavior. I think it's likely we're all going to learn some lessons that might serve us well for the rest of our lives, which is, why do you get flu every year? Because you're rubbing your nose, or those kinds of things. So maybe we can actually learn some important lessons in terms of our behavior and our awareness of infection. Now, we always want to balance that with, we don't want to wind up being so clean that we have a completely weakened immune system. I don't want to make it so complicated. I'm saying either or, one or the other. There's no hope. You can't choose. But I am telling you, we can get too clean. We've got lots of examples of that. But paying attention to how infectious the world is not a bad idea. And I hope that behavior lasts more than 2 years. But on a large scale, some of the public behavior is going to be at least another year. And I would say probably 2. All right. I'm getting more detail on Dr. Strangelove. I'm glad somebody else remembered
Santa
that.
Clara too extreme.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Question is, since Santa Clara is doing so well, have we been over the top? I think it's not so much we've been over the top that we kind of made some, we adopted some behaviors that probably didn't make any difference. And what I mean by that is if we were good about masks in public, and for some reason we all got this mixed message of don't wear a mask or do wear a mask, masks make a difference. And if we were all conscientious about masks in public settings, we were careful about not being crowded together in restaurants and so on and so forth, a lot, probably 90+% of whatever has happened beneficial in Santa Clara County would have happened without as broad and extensive a lockdown. But hopefully that's opening up some. Does that answer that?
Yep. Okay.
Oh, home care. That's for those who are infected or mildly so. That's been a real learning curve for my profession, but I think for people too. As you know, it is still a recommendation that if you believe you're sick, you don't go see your doctor. What has changed when that was kind of, what do I do with that advice? What has changed is the ability to get testing is much more broadly available, especially in Santa Clara County. You don't have to go through a health check and prove you've got fever and that you've got an uncle that's rich. You don't have to do that anymore. Pretty much anybody can get the test anytime for the virus, not the antibodies. They may have to make an appointment a day or two down the road, but almost everybody can get those tests. So at any point, anyone suspicious of that, they should get those tests. We provided that link, and we'd be glad to do that again to where you can make that. What else?
This one's a bit political. Did we talk?
Yeah, I got
Yeah,
that.
this is a bit political.
Okay. So, well, I'm one of the duties of a doctor is not always the same as the duty as a citizen, and that my duty is to stay out of the politics. But this raises a related political issue, and that have we learned some things that are important for national security? Because some, as you know, biowarfare is a real threat. It's something that we're all frightened or concerned about, or should be. And what constitutes a proper infrastructure to protect against that, or at least minimize that. Hopefully we've learned, and I think we will, we'll learn a lot about that. As you probably know, the history of medicine is full of how much we learned during warfare. Almost, some exceptions, many of the advances in biological science and medical treatment come out of warfare. That's when trauma and speed and overwhelming numbers come to fore for a society, and we learn a lot. And we've been in the kind of biological warfare, as you know. And with that setting, I think what we're going to learn from this will make a lot of difference going forward in terms of these national security issues and our vulnerability to biowarfare. So yeah, I think the learning from that has just begun. I don't think we're anywhere near fully understanding enough about the vectors. A lot of what has happened is this has exposed how poor our mathematical modeling is, and then also how inappropriate some of our expectations of the mathematical modeling have been. This is something you do on the fly and learn as you go. So it's not that all the guys who said we were all going to be dead were wrong, or all the guys who said nobody would be hurt were wrong. There's some learning as you go along, but that process of modeling and the kind of data that goes into a proper evolving model, we've learned a lot during this time. I think that will be helpful going forward for other diseases as well. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, again.
So even the person who asked the question knew I was going to kind of dodge it. So anyway, it doesn't help for me to help you to do anything other than tell you what I think the science says for us. So well, the question, now that's a fair enough question. What could we have done as a country? That's a great question. Without being political, looking at it as a science issue, we've actually done pretty well. This is what, the second or third largest physical country in the world. Russia's the largest, and we're the second largest. In terms of population, we're the third largest. There's so huge geographic area, many hundreds of millions of people. We have seen, if you look at that strains, that we've had so many different strains in New York as opposed to California, as opposed to upper Midwest, that the responses appropriate to each of those strains was just not known. If we had perfect foreknowledge, that's a ridiculous idea. We could have just shut down all the borders and shut down everybody's behavior, and yeah, we would have saved some people, and that's worth understanding. But that would have taken a kind of foreknowledge that we couldn't possibly have had. And as you also, so even though the deaths per 100,000 are so high in New York and New Jersey, they have a lot of extenuating conditions there. Again, keep in mind, even with those conditions, probably as a category, the largest single category of people who died from this were in nursing homes. And you know what? Those were people who were going to die anyway. And it's a tragedy that they died prematurely. In my opinion, that's a tragedy. So there's some aspects of that we could not have changed. We couldn't have taken everybody out of a nursing home, for example. So you could some infrastructural problems that were there. But I think given the kind of behavior that we've seen in Santa Clara Valley and how well it paid off in terms of lives saved, there are a lot of that behavior could have been adopted in other places. I don't know how you could have adopted the Santa Clara model for New York, for example, New York City. I don't know how that could have been done. Since everybody there is so dependent on public transportation, we've all got cars, you can see the differences. So I'm not sure as a nation we had a lot of other choices. I do not believe, and I will stick my toe into this particular strain, I do not think testing and tracing is that big a deal, would have made any difference for our nationwide response. Why? Too many people, too many places. And you know, if you did it on Kansas City, let's pick Kansas City. Yeah, it'll make a difference there because it has enough of an urban component, enough of a country component, enough of a public transportation that testing and tracing might make a difference. But on a nationwide scale, a one-size-fits-all amount of testing and tracing, I do not believe would be useful. I still think it won't be productive going forward. On the other hand, if you're in Los Gatos and you know some guy who's got it and he hung out with 4 people who now have it, that's worth testing and tracing their associates. But again, that's different than a national policy to do that for everybody everywhere. I don't see as a structural process how you would ever do that. I hope I didn't get in too much trouble with that, but that's my belief. Herd immunity, we're never, go ahead. What's that?
We're over an hour.
Oh, I'm over an hour. I'm sorry.
We're gonna do that last time.
Herd immunity. And because there's variety, we're going to have some herd immunity, but I think it's as likely that the virus is going to become weakened as it is we're going to have herd immunity. I'm going to turn off the muting in case somebody has some specific just questions you want to turn it off. I didn't.
Alt M.
Alt
or
M.
space bar maybe.
Space bar.
I need your little cup counting thing.
All right.
So, it holds. Just not by itself.
We're trying to open it up. Where?
Oh, it's under the drop down, isn't it? More. And
yeah, maybe you guys don't want to talk anyway. I think I've turned off everybody, and I wanted to open it up if there are any questions.
oh, I see that. Yeah. Space. That didn't work. We'll try Alt M again then.
Phil, the computer genius, has now turned off my entire computer. Do you guys have your, well, if you have questions.
Oh, we can unmute ourselves.
There it is.
There's one.
Because we had it, I had them, I turned off, I muted everybody and I didn't know if.
Yeah, but if everybody clicks on their microphone, they can talk now.
Okay, good. As I was saying, I'm over an hour, so I'm glad to just get off the air and quit bugging you. But if you've got some specific questions I haven't addressed in a few minutes, I'm happy to answer them.
Just like to thank you, Dr. Mike. It's been very informative. Thanks.
Thank you very much for being there. Glad to talk.
Same thing here, Mike. Dave and Ginger Egan are thanking you so much. I kind of miss working with you all the time, my friend.
Oh, it's good to see you. Hey, remember that? Be kind. And I know you guys all.
Yeah.
Let's leave it at that one so everybody remembers. That's the meaning of life, kindness.
That's good. Thank you, Mike. Bye-bye.